Ye saints that dwell on Europe's shore, prepare yourself with many more to leave behind your native land, for sure God's judgments are at hand.
One of the most remarkable experiments of transportation in the history of Western America was that of the Mormon handcart companies, who were to join in a mighty immigration movement to the western United States. The purpose of the gathering was to make a Zion people, to bring to the Utah Territory in the Rocky Mountains all of the new converts to the Mormon faith, so that they could live in unity and become pure in heart.
Well, some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill, as merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley, oh.
In the fall of 1855, in the Salt Lake Valley, a grasshopper plague and a hot summer had wreaked havoc with the crops. Some advised curtailing immigration for 1856. President Young wrote a general epistle to the saints in Europe.
We say, immigrate as speedily as possible to this vicinity.
To Franklin D. Richards, the president of the European Mission, he wrote,
We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past. I'm consequently thrown back upon my old plan to make handcarts and let the immigration foot it. They can come through in less time and escape the illnesses that annually lay so many of our brethren in the dust.
Prepare to cross the stormy main before you do the valley gain, and with the faithful make a start to cross the plains with your handcart.
The first two companies that were to make the great experiment were organized in early June 1856 under the leadership of Edmund Ellsworth and Daniel MacArthur. They left Iowa City 2 days apart. The carts were the usual width of a wide-track wagon and about 7 feet in length. Some were covered. This handcart belonged to Archer Walters, a carpenter from England. If a son was old enough, he helped his father pull, but in many instances the father had to pull the family cart without help. The open carts were often loaded with 400 to 500 pounds of flour, bedding, extra clothing, and a tent. The occupants of each tent were about 20 in number, and each tent was presided over by a president or tent captain. 5 tents were supervised by the captain of 100. It went very well for those first handcart companies, very much according to Brigham Young's original conception.
Well, some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill, as merrily on the way we go until we reach the valley, oh.
Merrily on their way? Much of the time, yes. For traveling with handcarts had its lighter moments, when the weather was good, the wagons strong, and the pullers and pushers well and healthy. It was a merrily on their way undertaking. But wagons had a way of breaking down. Weather had a habit of changing. People had a way of getting sick and needing to be carried. Shoes wore out. Provisions vital at one time could be great burdens another. A buffalo hide would be warm to sleep under at night, but you could wear yourself out carrying it in the daytime. Since the journey from Iowa City to Florence, Nebraska was through partly settled country, the travelers were able to obtain some supplies from the farmers en route. When the first handcart company reached Florence to rest, Archer Walters, the carpenter, spent 5 days mending handcarts. And even in those first 2 successful companies, death stalked the trail. To Brother Walters fell the lot of building coffins. His diary reveals the importance of his own crucial contribution to his fellow saints.
June 21st. Camped at Indian Creek. Brother Bauer died about 6 o'clock. Went to buy some wood to make the coffin, but the kind farmer gave me the wood and the nails. It had been a very hot day, and I was never more tired. But God has said, as my day, my strength shall be.
As the second handcart company ferried the Missouri River and pushed across Iowa, the sand and dust began to grind the wooden axles of the carts. Fortunately, Joseph Argyle, a tinner by trade, had with him a box of block tin. Working morning, noon, and night at the encampments, he used the tin and wrapped every axle. Much of the journey followed the Platte River, a natural waterway running almost 800 miles at a gentle slope, providing water and forage for those who crossed the plains. An important landmark was Chimney Rock, visible from miles and miles away. These landmarks were significant to the travelers, a reassurance that they were on the right trail. With no towns and cities and no road signs, such places were most significant. At Fort Laramie, the handcart pioneers were able to buy bacon and meal. Some used the precious bacon to grease their wagon wheels. Devil's Gate, just beyond the South Pass that marks the Great Divide, was a signal that they were entering mountain territory. At Fort Bridger, they were met by relief wagons with supplies from the valley. These first two companies were closely associated throughout the journey and reached the Salt Lake Valley on the same day, September 26, 1856. Their arrival was hailed in Utah as the successful culmination of a cherished experiment. The third handcart company was equally successful. In fact, 10 companies crossed the plains. The fourth and fifth, who also crossed in 1856, were the only two who had severe difficulty. But they were the ones with the greatest number, 1,000. They experienced serious complications. Because of a misunderstanding between the British and American agents, the handcarts for these companies had not been built at Iowa City, and the people had to wait until this could be done. As a consequence, the last company did not leave Iowa City until July 28th. They were further delayed at the winter quarters staging area in Florence, Nebraska. Most of the people had no idea of the problems likely to be experienced in the territory ahead. A few seasoned frontiersmen thought that it was too risky to attempt the crossing so late in the season. Levi Savage declared that with a mixed company of aged people, women, and little children, they could not cross the plains and the mountains without much suffering, sickness, and death. He therefore advised going into winter quarters without delay. But the majority, fired by the enthusiasm which had brought them in the first place, voted to leave, trusting to God that they would have no trouble. The Willie Company left the Missouri River Point on August 17, 1856. The Martin Company 10 days later, at the end of August. President Franklin D. Richards had been released from his European mission, and after fulfilling the gigantic assignment of putting 3,000 saints into ships and settling related business, he arrived in Florence, Nebraska just in time to assist the last companies to get off on their journey over the plains. He and his associates left after all of the others. But because they were traveling with horses and mules and in carriages and light wagons, they caught up with the handcart companies as they were trudging up the Platte River. The Richards group gave them encouragement and hurried on to Salt Lake City with the promise to send back supplies as quickly as possible. On the 1st of September, the Willie Company reached Fort Laramie, but the provisions they had expected were not there. They estimated that they would run out when they were still 350 miles from their destination. Captain Willie received a letter from Franklin Richards informing him that they might expect to meet the supply train at South Pass. This meant that rations, already drastically reduced, would have to be cut even further. Franklin Richards arrived in Salt Lake City on October 4th, and there, Brigham Young learned for the first time that the handcart companies were still on the plains, and that if help did not get to them, 1,000 people could perish. He took action immediately. Speaking in conference the next day, he spoke of the plight of the travelers, saying,
"The text will be to get them here. I shall call upon the bishops today for 60 mule teams and 12 or 15 wagons. I want the sisters to have the privilege of fetching in blankets, shirts, stockings, and food."
16 wagon loads of food and supplies were readied the next day. Back on the plains, nature was dealing a cruel blow. The winter that year was uncommonly early, and the further the handcart companies went, the slower and more difficult their progress became. They were sick and dying, weak with hunger and numb with cold. Buffalo had stampeded their cattle. Bedding that had been thrown out because it was too heavy was desperately needed now as the nights became increasingly colder. The old and infirm began to die. until it was soon unusual to leave a campground without burying someone. When the snowstorm came, the shrill wind blew furiously about them. The snow fell several inches deep, but they dared not stop. The help from the valley met the same storm and had camped to await better weather. When Captain Willie, who had left his company to get help, met the rescuers and told them how destitute his people were, they immediately hitched up their wagons and made all possible speed to come to their rescue. For many, however, it was too late. Among the most devastating of the experiences was one that came to the Martin Company when they had to ford the Platte River a little west of present Casper, Wyoming. The river was wide, the current strong, and the water exceedingly cold. Blocks of mush, snow, and ice had to be dodged. Within 9 days after crossing the North Platte, the Martin Company lost 56 of their number. Always there was a prayer in their hearts and on their lips. The Lord is mindful of our prayers, but sometimes it is through another person that he meets our needs. For many of the prayerful, Ephraim Hanks became that other person. On a trip from Provo to Salt Lake, he had stopped for the night with a friend in the small town of Draper. Ephraim writes,
"While I still lay wide awake in my bed, I heard a voice calling me by name and then saying, 'The handcart people are in trouble and you're wanted. Will you go and help them?' Well, I looked up and saw a man. Without any hesitation, I answered, 'Yes, I'll go if I'm called.' Well, I'd laid only a few minutes when the voice called a second time, repeating almost the same as before. This was then repeated a third time to me. When I got up the next morning, I said to Brother Brown, 'The handcart people are in trouble, and I promised to go out and help them.' But I didn't tell him of my experience during the night. I now hastened to Salt Lake City and arrived there on the Saturday preceding the Sunday on which the call was made for volunteers to go out. Well, the next day I was wending my way eastward over the mountains with a light wagon all alone.
Ephraim met the storm at South Pass. It stalled him for 3 days, but being deeply concerned about the fate of the immigrants, he set out with 2 animals, one to ride and one to pack, still alone. That night, as Ephraim prepared to make a bed in the snow, he thought how much a buffalo robe would help him. His account reads,
Now, I am a firm believer in the efficacy of prayer, and I asked the Lord to send me a buffalo. But when I, after praying as I did on that lonely night in South Pass, looked around me and spied a buffalo bull within 50 yards of my camp, my surprise was complete. I had certainly not expected so immediate an answer to my prayer. However, I soon collected myself and, taking deliberate aim, my first shot brought him down. He rolled down in the very hollow where I was encamped.
Hanks enjoyed the night and the meat, loaded it on his horse, and killed another buffalo the next day. He recounts,
I finally came to the party. The sight that met my gaze can never be erased from my memory. The starved forms and haggard countenances of the poor sufferers as they moved about slowly, shivering from the cold to prepare their scanty evening meal, was enough to touch the stoutest heart. When they saw the supply of fresh meat I brought into their camp, their gratitude knew no bounds. Flocking around me, one would say, "Oh, please, give me a small piece of meat." Another would say, "Oh, my poor children are starving. Do give me a little." The prophecy had been made by one of the brethren that the company should feast on buffalo meat. This was the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophecy. But only the beginning, as I afterwards shot and killed a number of buffalo for them as we journeyed along.
The first help to come was scanty, just enough to encourage the saints with the fact that more was going to be available. The dispatches to Salt Lake read,
I have never felt so much interest in my mission, and all the brethren who came out with me feel the same. We'll move every day towards the valley if we have to shovel snow to do it. I have never seen such energy and faith among the boys, nor so good a spirit among those who came out with me.
At last the final rescue came, sustained by food they blessed each name, with thankful hearts that one and all could heed the come to Zion call.
The last of the Martin Company were carried in the relief wagons into the Salt Lake Valley, arriving there on the 30th of November. 3/4 of them had survived. November 30th was a Sunday. The faithful saints were assembled, and Brigham Young spoke to the congregation.
When those persons arrive, I do not want to see them put into houses by themselves. I want to have them distributed in the city amongst the families that have good and comfortable houses. And I wish all the sisters now before me, and all who know how and can, to nurse and wait upon the newcomers and prudently administer medicine and food to them. Many of them have frozen hands and feet. The afternoon meeting will be omitted. Prayer is good, but when baked potatoes and pudding and milk are needed, prayer will not supply their place. We want you to receive them as your own children and to have the same feeling for them. We are their temporal saviors, for we have saved them from death.
In the years 1856 to 1870, almost 3,000 men, women, and children pulling handmade two-wheeled carts trudged some 1,300 miles to the Zion of their hopes. Most of them praised this method of transportation as the simplest and most efficient, and overall, Brigham Young's experiment was a success. Their hearts rejoiced because they were now gathered to Zion, the place where God's children were establishing the kingdom of God on earth. Like Israel of old, they had found the promised land.